speaker for the first session of the afternoon, which brings in comparative perspectives from the New World, is Tom Garrison, who's currently at USC. So Tom and John worked most closely together, I think, on a graduate seminar that they co-taught on Old World and New World approaches to archaeology. And the topic that came up, or I should say the phrase that came up most frequently in these seminars when people were kind of having discussions about the work they did or how they went about doing that work especially was, wait, you do what? And so I think that's something that Tom comes back to quite often in his discussions with myself and John and other chiefly Old World archaeologists. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tom Garrison.
Thanks, Alex. Welcome to the portion of the day where we compete for strangest submission to Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology. See if I can get this to work. Okay. So, as Alex said, John and I designed a class together here, and thinking about Sue talking about the talk last night where John brings out the calendar, I remember planning that seminar, and John brought out the calendar, and it was more of a, who can we get to come talk this week so that we don't have to do anything? So it was a little easier than being his student. It was great to be a collaborator. But no, John has certainly impacted my career, always good for a begrudging last-second letter, and here he came and watched me dig up a California racehorse, so it's an honor to be here. Like many Mayanists, I first became familiar with the work of John F. Cherry with his landmark volume on pure polity interaction, which he co-edited with Colin Renfrew. I won't pretend that I read it when I was 8 years old, but it was certainly the first thing that came to my attention. So in his case study of Minoan state formation, Cherry concludes by stating, pure polity interaction, in short, may be an abstract concept, seemingly far removed from the archaeological record itself, but it has the virtue of encouraging detailed factual research stimulated by fresh questions. So, inspired by this statement, here I present a new model for examining ancient Maya political structure and interactions based on the concept of hierarchically embedded heterarchies, following Cherry's goal of inspiring new research and fresh questions. So, in considering the hierarchical aspects of Maya political structure, there are really two types of hierarchy with which the archaeologist must contend. The first, the settlement hierarchy, is defined by survey data and epigraphic analysis. And the second, which is more environmentally based, the physiographic hierarchy, is defined by geographic, ecological, and paleoenvironmental analysis. Both of these hierarchies are related to and affected political structure. From a settlement perspective, territories, political territories, define themselves in relation to one another and based upon their constituent components. And then from a physiographic perspective, physiography played an important role as the environmental setting of a political territory would dictate local subsistence strategies as well as resource availability, indicating that there were closer structural similarities between political territories within the same environmental setting than those that were located elsewhere. And so another Brit. In the 1970s, David Clark proposed that settlement patterns should be investigated through the use of nested hierarchies of analysis. And as long as we're going back to some older stuff today, I'd like to point out that powerful analytical tools like GIS, which didn't exist in David Clark's time, warrant a revisit to some of his theories, which were really ahead of their time in terms of conceptualizing spatial relationships in the past. And so today what I'm going to do is combine aspects of these settlement and physiographic hierarchies and propose a new analytical hierarchy for studying the ancient Maya consisting of the four tiers that you see here. And I'm briefly going to define them, but the main focus of my written contribution for this conference is going to look at case studies of territories and alliances, although based on what I've heard about word counts, I may have to reduce that to one of these. But here today, I'm just going to focus on the model itself due to our time constraints and really not wanting to bore a bunch of Mediterranean archaeologists with the nitty-gritty of Maya archaeology. So, areas are the minimal unit of spatial analysis in the hierarchy I'm proposing here, and they can be analyzed independently or as a representative portion of a territory, the next tier up in the hierarchy. They're a combination of settlement and micro-environmental components, and they're also the most subjective and arbitrary level of the hierarchy I'm proposing, as different researchers may choose to divide their research universe into areas in different ways. I see this as actually a positive aspect of the concept, since it permits different researchers to investigate a single place from multiple perspectives, facilitating the comparison of different models. Here we see a territory with its constituent areas. Territories are really the most stable unit of independent socio-political organization for the ancient Maya and are roughly analogous to the pure polities that Cherry was talking about in the 80s. The territory represents the sum of its constituent areas, both in terms of settlement and microenvironmental diversity, and they're generally composed of a capital city and its hinterland. And as in the case of the example shown here, there can actually be multiple capitals in a single territory as long as they don't overlap chronologically. So one can be in power for a time and then it can shift to another. Adaptive regions are areas within the greater Maya lowlands that have environmental characteristics that are distinct from adjoining areas. And here you're seeing the Three Rivers region, of which the San Bartolo Xultun territory I was just showing is part of. The distinct characteristics of these adaptive regions also define some degree of regional cultural affiliation, as populations are faced with subsisting within the same environmental context and sharing access to similar resource types. And then there were periods when Maya territories would join together into broader macro-political organizations, usually under the auspices of a single powerful dynasty whose ruler would be a sort of over-king, to use the words of Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruba. However, despite the hierarchical nature of some of the statements in the hieroglyphic record that are made regarding these unions, I prefer to think of them as alliances, since the preeminent center didn't really have the military power to subdue all of its allies, and the territorial kings who participated in these broader alliances really maintained their power locally, usually with all of the full titles and trappings of kingship. So when these alliances eventually ended up dissolving or being forcibly interrupted, most of the constituent territories actually returned to a state of political autonomy and maintain their stability at the local level. So that's why I choose to think of these moments of unity really as being alliances rather than being under the auspices of a single place. So the analytical hierarchy that I presented here really shows a way of organizing the analysis of ancient Maya politics, but it holds little in the way of explanatory power. To achieve explanation, I borrowed these concepts that you see here from landscape ecology. These concepts can be taken out of their original environmental context and applied to the structure and interactions of different levels of the hierarchy I presented. So the structure is defined as the composition of a landscape. Functions are interactions that occur within the landscape, and change are environmental and human-induced changes that alter both the structure and the functions. So as some examples, the structure of the Maya area could be understood as the composition of the area as defined by its constituent adaptive regions, of which there are 31 of them defined by geographers, which you see here. Functions are the various cultural interactions that occurred at different levels of the analytical hierarchy that allowed the Maya to sustain themselves. This included heterarchical interactions between units in the same level of the hierarchy, as well as peaceful transactions made between units in a hierarchical relationship. An example of the latter would be a local tribute payment to the king that would then be reciprocated by public rituals intended to benefit the members of the community as a whole. Change is what happened when the structure of the hierarchy is affected. So alterations in the structure can also cause changes in patterns of interaction as defined by the function concept. Change can refer to environmental changes, sometimes caused or accelerated by human action, but examples would be drought, deforestation, erosion, El Nino events. I know you guys don't talk about that a lot in the Mediterranean, but El Nino is a thing for us. And increased seasonality. It can also refer to anthropogenic changes to the hierarchical structure, things like warfare, accessions of particularly charismatic leaders, exogamous marriages, changing tribute patterns, changing trade routes, and entrance into an alliance. Major changes to the structure of the analytical hierarchy are often identifiable archaeologically, and the application of these concepts from landscape ecology provide a mechanism for explanation. So, in this ridiculous figure, the integration of the proposed analytical hierarchy and the explanatory power of landscape ecology concepts is here articulated in what I call an embedded heterarchy model. Embedded heterarchies are lattice-like exchange networks assumed under the control of a larger entity. So at the most basic level, embedded heterarchies were the sustaining force of every territory in the Maya area. The hinterland population would harvest resources from throughout the territory, providing for themselves as well as the population of the territorial capital. So all of these different areas would interact with one another in heterarchical relationships. We see another embedded heterarchy existing among the territorial elites within the same adaptive region. So that's sort of in the middle tier there, where you might see two territorial capitals who are interacting with one another heterarchically. This heterarchy manifests itself in things like shared elite material culture, as well as in the exchange of ideas resulting from a common perception of local, regional, environmental diversity. And then during the periods of larger alliances, interregional groups of territories made up an embedded heterarchy whose interactions contributed to a sense of shared affiliation within the larger alliance. So here, only one of our territories is involved in one of the alliances proposed here. Other territories could choose to maintain their independent status. So, the embedded heterarchy model that I'm proposing here emphasizes the stability of ancient Maya political structure and emphasizes how change is scale dependent. So, for example, a military defeat for a site did not demonstrably affect the day-to-day agricultural activities of the Maya farmer, but it was devastating to the ruling elite residing in the capital. So should the complex histories and political interactions recorded in the epigraphic record really matter when examining the humble remains of inner site archaeology or the rural Maya? Probably not. Similarly, while subsistence strategies are obviously important to the population as a whole, the Maya elite were mostly concerned with the performance of ritual to perpetuate their states. If the archaeologist is addressing issues of dynastic legitimacy and hierarchical social organization, then preference needs to be given to analysis of the political economy and exchange networks. So it's all about what level you're really interested in the questions that you're asking. Transitional periods are really the key moments when the archaeologist may study processes that affect numerous scales of analysis. Processes of change occurred during transitional periods that led to the reorganization of the socio-political order. The embedded heterarchy model that I'm proposing here allows for the identification of major patterns of change that may then be integrated with identified spatial trends in order to build a model that really best reflects the available data. Through the application of this model, and by looking at different spatial scales and temporal trends, Maya archaeologists can reconcile culture history on the one hand with process and explanation on the other. So, just let that one settle in for a little bit. Just as pure polity interaction did, I hope that this model will initiate new discussions and arguments regarding ancient Maya political structure and interaction. So thanks for everything, John. And if you don't agree with any of this, at least I know I can fight with Whitmore about it later. So, thanks a lot.
Forgotten about the Banks costume. You were dressed up for that party? Anyway, So, I would like to convince you that our next speaker parallels John Cherry's interests, his methodological approaches in two key respects, and I emphasize key respects. Comparative island archaeologists, with apologies to the collection of those in the room, tend to be quite thin on the ground. Right? You argue for comparison, you attempt comparison at some sort of meta-analytical level, but you work on your island or in your place, right? Scott Fitzpatrick, who's our next speaker, straddles aerial divide, intellectual divide in ways that parallel how John has straddled similar divides in the Old World and the New World. Scott has conducted fieldwork in both the Caribbean, depending on your preference, and also in the Pacific, and has moved back and forth fairly frequently between the two. So in that respect, Scott's interest in island archaeology parallel John's and his interest in comparison. The second key respect is that the first time I met Scott, which was in Chris Brzezinski's office in 2009, I think, the mind boggles, became very clear that the meeting was going to go very, very well when a bottle of Buffalo Trace was produced, I think around 2:45 in the afternoon. And both John and Scott agreed this was the perfect accompaniment to a serious discussion of island archaeology. And then by about 5 o'clock, the bottle had disappeared. So I would like to welcome Scott Fitzpatrick, who is Associate Professor of Anthropology in the University of Oregon, who will be talking today on islands in the comparative stream, the importance of inter-island analogies to archaeological discourse. Please join me in welcoming Scott.
Well, thank you, Tom and Alex, for the really kind invitation to be here today and around so many of his students and colleagues. I'm really extremely pleased and very honored to be here today, and truly I am, for John and many of his former students and colleagues have greatly influenced my own career in mostly positive ways. And some sit here before you as a testament to John's innate ability to attract, mentor, and occasionally put up with bright minds. I notice Mike Parker Pearson isn't here today, but there are many others in this room that qualify. Island archaeology as a subfield of study has garnered a fair amount of scholarly attention over the last few decades. Some have argued that this is a false distinction, and that islands, as far as humans are concerned, are really no different than other kinds of land masses. Paul Rainbird, in a paper published in 1999 in the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology, argued that the very notion of islands being considered different by anthropologists and archaeologists was rooted in Western concepts that privileged bias assumptions of isolation and remoteness. This had manifested itself in literature, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Paul Thoreau's The Happy Isles of Oceania, and one of my favorites, The Mysterious Island by Jules Verne. There are, of course, countless other examples in books and cinema that expound on these concepts, and there really is no question that islands have been conceptualized differently and sometimes erroneously by many laymen and scholars alike. In addition, Rainbird and other researchers have criticized island archaeology for its earlier emphasis on them being cultural laboratories and the use of biogeographical principles to try and explain the variables that may have influenced how islands were colonized. While this concept has waned over time and is no longer considered a perfectly appropriate means to examine populations cross-culturally, it is generally agreed upon that there is merit in analyzing island populations differently for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that islands can be considered model systems ecologically. This is something that Peter Wojtusek has been writing about for the last 15 years, and that are also suitable for examining a host of issues relating to human colonization, which Pat Kirch, the well-known Pacific archaeologist, has also written extensively about. I think we can agree that islands are inherently different given a milieu of these and other factors. After all, the very fact that most islands around the world were settled relatively late in time points to certain social and technological issues that must be overcome to ensure both successful travel and colonization. This includes suitable watercraft, seafaring and navigational skills, and the translocation of plants and animals. The fact that humans are by their very nature not very good swimmers, apart from these and maybe other Olympians, And given the sheer distances involved to settle most islands is a testament to why islands can be conceived of differently, at least in my opinion. So if island archaeology can be distinguished separately in its own right, then we can move beyond singular case studies and begin to compare them both within and outside of major island regions. In a paper published by John Cherry in 1981, nearly 35 years ago, he stated in the abstract, "When and how were the Mediterranean islands first settled? Has insularity itself, the special characteristics of islands everywhere, acted as a constraint on the manner and rate of their colonization by man?" Not to deviate too much from my main message, but I've been working on islands for about 20 years, and given what I know about group dynamics and biological processes, I'm pretty sure that women were involved in this process too. So just throwing that out there. If so, is it possible for archaeologists to make use of ecological and biogeographical models which have been developed to account for the abundance and diversity of animals and plants on islands of varying size and remoteness? As a reflection of personal research interests, I emphasize that East Mediterranean evidence, but there are useful insights to be gleaned, I believe, by comparing what we find there with the pattern for the islands of the West. So here we see an early effort to do this kind of comparative work in an island region. Not long after, a seminal paper by Bill Keegan and Jared Diamond, and despite what you may think of Jared Diamond, this was a pretty important paper. He's, of course, not an archaeologist, but nonetheless, this provided what was really the first major attempt to comparatively examine the colonization of islands from a biogeographical perspective. They were, quote unquote, interested in questions of when, how, and why pre-industrial human populations reached oceanic islands and what happened to the populations after arrival, and concluded that biogeographical principles can be used to identify significant patterns in the spatial distribution of insular cultures. While some may take issue with this observation, especially given that humans are good at circumventing many of the parameters to island colonization that confront them, this includes winds and currents, acquiring water and other resources in impoverished environments, biogeography still seems to be a reasonable approach to explore so long as human ingenuity is recognized as playing an important role. In Cyprian Broodbank's 2002 tome entitled An Island Archaeology of the Early Cyclades, he noted that another hardy aspect is the suggestion that island groups are ideal places to construct comparative experiments in adaptation and differentiation among discrete island populations that share an original common culture, a concept that he rightly derived and noted was from Evans's earlier works in the Mediterranean in the 1970s. It was only 10 years previous to Cyprian's book that I had the opportunity as an undergraduate to first work on an island archaeologically. The experiences I had working on Barbados with Peter Druitt from the Institute of Archaeology at University College London were pivotal in the sense that it was all very new to me. The only other place I had flown to prior to that was Hawaii the year before. So I had in a short period of time been to two islands very far apart with significantly different cultural histories. And that piqued my interest in answering the very questions that John had proffered in his 1981 paper on the Mediterranean, and which had been amplified by others, including many of his protégés. This brings us to a larger body of questions of how comparative island archaeology is developed and how it has been useful if we agree that it has. What have we learned from talking to each other? Has there actually been substantive benefit from getting people in the same room and talking about these issues? What hasn't moved forward? Are the gulfs between data and tradition perhaps sometimes too large to allow for meaningful comparison? I've written a number of papers over the years highlighting what I and others believe are core constituents of the subfield of island archaeology. And in a recent review published in the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, my colleagues and I, John Erlandson and Torben Rick, outlined 13 of these components, which included the following, and I won't go over each and every one, but while I would like to highlight a few of these, especially because John has been influential in developing or highlighting how these have helped answer some of the questions above related to the necessity of having a comparative island archaeology. To do this, I would like to provide a few insights and analogies that tie in with the general theme of this event. In terms of scholarly approaches to archaeological research, much has been made of the fox and the hedgehog. for which John is proffered by some to be both: the hedgehog, whose life's work is built around a single great idea, and the fox, who works instead with multiple concepts. To this, I do not disagree, but I also believe that this may mask other equally important animalistic dichotomies and analogies to which John subscribes, or that can be used in some way to describe aspects of his career that have been attended to or influenced, that's influenced him, others, and various archaeologists in other island regions. The first one is human impacts and historical ecology. In a Pacific folktale, the rat refuses to share food with a land crab, and when they go sailing, the land crab chews a hole in the boat and walks along the seafloor, leaving the rat to drown. But the rat prevails upon an octopus to carry him to a shore on its head. As it does so, the rat chews the hair off the octopus's head and then skips ashore, jeers at his bald benefactor, and arranges to have him killed and eaten. This widespread story acknowledges in sly self-awareness by Pacific Islanders the consequences of human arrival in the islands of remote Oceania. In many regards, John's efforts to examine islands within and between regions was pivotal in that it laid the groundwork for archaeologists to develop or make use of ecological models to account for the abundance and diversity of animals and plants on islands of varying size and remoteness. An historical ecology framework which has guided many archaeologists over the last 20 years and is becoming increasingly useful for identifying long-term changes to island environments by humans by collating disparate lines of evidence: archaeological, anthropological, historical, paleoecological, to answer questions about the degree of human impact on what were once pristine environments. The next one is an expanding methodological toolkit, and for this I use the tortoise and the hare. As one of Aesop's better-known fables, the story focuses on a competition between unequal partners where ingenuity and persistence are employed to overcome what on the surface appears to be a stronger opponent. John's career is somewhat reminiscent of this in the sense that his scholarly pursuits for many years dealt with the Mediterranean, where he refined his craft and developed new ideas of how to see the world through an archaeological lens. He is primarily recognized for his research here, though in recent years he has moved to another large sea, the Caribbean, applying many of the methodological and theoretical skills he refined in one island region to another. In this sense, he's a tortoise whose steady strength, whose calculated and methodical movements have paid major dividends from a comparative island archaeological framework. In particular, John's fieldwork on the volcanically active island of Montserrat, which combines targeted surveys, high-resolution mapping, and risk assessment to archaeological sites, is a carryover from strategies practiced in the Mediterranean and brought into an area where these types of research designs were virtually unknown. That he and his research group have included both prehistoric and historic sites in his inventory, something that Cyprian mentioned earlier, is particularly noteworthy, as this has rarely been done in the Caribbean. It is also a testament to how John has bridged the gap between data and tradition, for few Caribbean archaeologists up until relatively recently had actually worked on islands outside their area, leading to a degree of shameful insularity that was and still is frustratingly painful to deal with. Essentially, this is a testament to how slow and steady wins the race. Now, while I'm a relative newcomer to John's intellectual world, I did have the opportunity to begin corresponding with him a little more than 10 years ago as part of a chapter he agreed to write for an island archaeological volume I was putting together. And as I recall, there was a little bit of coaxing involved with this, but John finally came through to contribute what was really the only major Mediterranean paper to that volume, for which I was very thankful. It's only recently, however, that I've had a chance to engage with him more closely as he began conducting research in the Caribbean, and as a result, interact with some of his graduate students, especially Tom, one of the co-organizers for this event. Now, as a member of Tom's PhD committee and seeing the interactions that went on between student and advisor, it reminded me of another one of my favorite animal dichotomies, Tom and Jerry, or might we call it Tom and Cherry. The plot of each of these short animated cartoons usually centers on Tom's numerous attempts to capture Jerry and the mayhem and destruction that follows. Tom rarely succeeds in catching Jerry, mainly because of Jerry's cleverness, cunning abilities, and luck. However, there are also several instances within the cartoons when they display genuine friendship and concern for each other's well-being. At other times, the pair set aside the rivalry in order to pursue a common goal. And I see this as sort of endemic with a lot of John's students as I'm slowly learning. In this sense, John has passed the torch once again to a student who has come to think about islands and the prehistory of each of those contextually that can be compared and contrasted, and that lead to a more thorough understanding of why islands can indeed be conceptualized differently than continental regions. There have been many earlier attempts to examine the manifestations of island life in the ancient past. In an essay on the construction of Rapa Nui's famous moai, Marshall Solins in 1955 argued that this was a case of esoteric efflorescence, in which the limited resources available in a very circumscribed and remote island environment led Easter Islanders to create increasingly larger stone statues. Colin Renfrew in 1984 also suggested a similar phenomenon for temples found on Malta. These and many other studies on islands around the world have provided a strong foundation for identifying features of islands that may be similar or unique, and that have indeed enriched how we think of island societies in the past. John Cherry has, of course, been instrumental in the development of island archaeology, trained students to continue this work, and thankfully provided an enriched understanding of island cultures that has reached significantly beyond the boundaries of terra firma and the Middle Sea. So thank you, John, for all that you've done. One thing before I leave the podium, I also have a gift for John. I originally grew up in Oregon. I'm very fortunate to have gone back and be a part of the University of Oregon's Department of Anthropology, where I also did my PhD. And Oregon is known for a few things. One is having the best craft brewery industry in the nation, maybe the world. It's also well known for their Pinot Noirs. And Oregon is also well known for having beat Michigan the last 2 times they played them in football. Oregon is also well known now for having a burgeoning spirit distillery industry. And so I've brought John a bottle of rye whiskey from Central Oregon, which is purported to be quite good. I don't know if it's as good as Oregon football, but John, you can at least drown your sorrows to the Michigan losses.
Well done, man. Thank you, Scott. Our final speaker in this session, which is going right on time, is Krista Brzezinski, who is John's co-director on his current field project in Montserrat, Survey and Landscape Archaeology on Montserrat, or SLAM. Krista's wife, Caitlin, is also here and deserves special mention as John's sometime roommate, as she stayed in Providence for a year to finish her police training after Krista moved to start her new job at Wayne State. John kindly took her in, along with the cats. My fondest memories of Krista and John are from the summer of 2009, when the 3 of us hit the Bourbon Trail through Kentucky, the epic conclusion of which involved a visit to the infamous Creation Museum. Some of you saw pictures of this last night. I remember Krista being convinced that we were going to be spotted and thrown out for all of the perhaps non-traditional photos that John was taking. Again, some of you saw the pictures last night. With that, I'll turn it over to Krista.
Should have worn my Pick Jesus shirt today. That would have really tied it all together. So I changed the title a little bit. I realized the title I committed to was something that I agreed upon when I was deliriously pregnant, and it made absolutely no sense. So I've narrowed the focus a little bit. So hopefully we're off to a good start today. Thank you, Alex and Tom, for involving me in today's fraternity party conference, whatever you want to call it. I'm starting to feel like I hold a bit of a disadvantage here, being among the few presenters who hasn't ever taken a class with John, confession. Had him on my graduate or undergraduate committee, or taught a class with him, or served on an editorial board with him. But I have to say, I've been most fortunate to learn from John in the field, almost exclusively, on our jointly run SLAM project, which is not a PAP, as Jackie pointed out last night, but does have the unfortunate coincidental name as the most popular condom brand on the island. SLAM. We didn't know that until we got there. But it's a great field kit item for the undergraduates. But anyway, on the SLAM project will actually be, as of next season, the longest running fieldwork project of John's career, and I fact-checked that with him. There are some reasons why, we don't have to get into that now, but I just want to say that John's been all ears when it comes to sharing his experience in other parts of the world and on surveys, and also enthusiastically learning about a new region and historical archaeology, which is what I'm talking about today, and I'm most grateful to you for that, John. It's been an absolute pleasure to work with you. So, on to the good stuff. The Caribbean of interest to historical archaeologists, that of the past 500 years or so, is a multicultural region, more defined, perhaps, in research practice by past colonial associations than maybe topography, connectivity, or in some cases, actual historical relationships. Even today, islands remain clustered around European colonial affiliations, and it can be challenging to address issues of mobility and even locality and transfer between islands. Survey has long been a tool for inventorying cultural resources and identifying research sites in many islands of the Lesser Antilles regions, especially the French West Indies, but survey itself is an approach that seems to encompass drastically different reconnaissance and survey techniques depending on the island, as Scott was alluding to. Although a fairly robust survey-based gray literature exists across the region, as a primary approach, especially in historical archaeology, diachronic regional survey and even landscape archaeology is hardly standard and is hardly a well-developed component of archaeological practice. If I were to summarize the truly diachronic survey-based projects in the Lesser Antilles, this paper would be, as John pointed out when he saw the title, over in 2 minutes, but you're not that lucky. Had to come up with something. So I figured I'd first discuss a couple of the issues, environment and scale, which are two of the many factors why I think survey approaches have difficulty coalescing into a tradition of practice in the region. And I'll eventually wind up summarizing a few examples that I think illustrate the eclectic array of survey applications that are being used productively to study historic period settlements and landscapes. So let's start with the most obvious challenge to conducting Caribbean survey, the thorns. And despite the photos of our living conditions that John likes to circulate in Photoshop and trick his colleagues with in Greece, Caribbean islands are incredibly difficult working environments, hindered by poor visibility, painful plants, and generally unpleasant tropical conditions. Every Caribbean archaeologist has their own horror story involving a harrowing encounter with killer plants and animals, and everyone has heard John tell the story. Sue told it last night. We've all heard it at least twice, about him being almost blinded by the sap from the unassuming manchineel trees on Montserrat, and I'm really upset that I couldn't find the picture of your face swollen from these trees, but you probably deleted it. Drama aside, these conditions do pose real limitations for conducting probabilistic and systematic pedestrian survey. Crawling on hands and knees, scrambling up rock faces, and macheteing through brush on extensive tract surveys are certainly more common than intensive field walking across open plow zones or controlled surface collection. It's just not practical, productive, or in many cases possible to conduct this sort of pedestrian survey that our Mediterranean colleagues enjoy and benefit from. But when we say we're doing survey in the Caribbean, we're talking about a different but no less robust species of systematic recovery. Scale is the second major challenge to the current state of survey projects in the region's historical archaeology. And when I say scale, I'm talking about both temporal span and geographic scope. This issue attends to the fact that the vast majority of archaeological research either stops or starts at the misleadingly momentous Columbian Divide, 1492 or thereabouts. As a result, there exist two distinct traditions of scholarly research in Caribbean archaeology. Pre-Columbian research focused especially on the peopling of the islands and regional interaction spheres, and post-Columbian historical archaeological studies mainly oriented towards the experience of European colonization and the growth of plantation-based economies and labor systems. And these historical studies are typically accessed through the lens of individual sites. For historical archaeologists, this division eclipses and understates what was actually a very uneven period of European colonization, one that occurred over the course of a century or more in smaller, less hospitable places like Montserrat and Dominica, for example. Here, the issue of pace is overlooked, both in regards to the pace that capitalism, colonial hierarchies, and industries became inscribed on the landscape, and to the pace that indigenous populations responded to the arrival of Europeans and enslaved Africans. The Columbian Divide also fails to recognize continuities in material culture traditions, exchange networks, and other indigenous practices that were integrated into post-Columbian communities. Even more problematic is that these self-imposed temporal limits further assumptions about island settlement patterns over time. Some historic period scholars have gone so far as to assert with confidence, based on the absence of early records or high visibility early colonial sites, that the islands were completely empty of settlements at the time of European arrival. And this story is one that perpetuates the myth of indigenous disappearance and discounts the inter-island mobility that facilitated island Carib or Kalinago resistance into modern times. It's a story that's recounted in the histories of St. Eustatius, Nevis, Montserrat, Dominica, and others, and even in archaeological peer-reviewed publications, most notably Robert Evans' chapter in the 1968 IACA conference proceedings entitled "The Lack of Archaeology in Dominica," which concluded that Dominica was a mere stepping stone for more desirable places and offered minimal prospects for long-term settlements. Unfortunately, this has since been totally disproven by the survey and excavation work of Honeychurch, Hauser, Lennoxshire, and many others. When it comes to projects that are truly diachronic in scale and scope, meaning survey-based research that seeks to identify all traces of human activity on the islands over the course of their 4,000 to 6,000 year history, these are a complete rarity, even though landscape approaches have the potential to augment complementary research goals shared on both sides of the Columbian Divide. Our SLAM project is one of the only current projects that involves prehistorians and historical archaeologists in equal measure in its design and execution. Ours might be conceived of as a broad diachronic approach, but there are other diachronic projects. They tend to fall on either side of the Columbian Divide, but these archaeologists and many others operate with more truncated diachronic time spans in their investigations of island settlement patterns, and they tend to cover either centuries of a shorter horizon, a particular culture group, or even a generation. So I just want to move on to, for a minute, a few comments about the state of Caribbean historical archaeology generally. Over the past 20 years, the flavor of historical archaeology has matured into a decidedly multi-scalar, micro-regional, and multi-sited focus. Owing to pioneering work by Jim Dell in Jamaica, Doug Armstrong in Barbados and St. John, Lydia Pulsifer and Matt Goodwin on Montserrat, and others, interested in how capitalism and European colonization transformed island landscapes and how both locality and regionality were experienced by island residents, especially enslaved Africans and others whose histories were undocumented. These studies were groundbreaking because they moved away from single site studies and extended their gaze beyond the industrial core of plantations, considering the broader landscapes of production and dwelling, including slave villages, provisions gardens, road systems, caves, gullies, and other places. Each of these surveys and studies have included some element of survey: transect-based pedestrian survey, map-based reconnaissance, GIS, controlled surface collection, or remote sensing, as with the case of Finch's work at the Mount Plantation on Barbados. So now on to a few examples that illustrate some of the many different applications of historic period survey and kind of different combinations. Recent work by Mark Hauser as part of the Archaeological Survey of Colonial Dominica demonstrates the potential of pedestrian survey approaches to examine local variability in settlement patterning and land use among 4 plantation estates and their surrounding landscape within the island's Portsmouth microregion. From this data, Hauser examines how planters intentionally created what he calls blind spots that allowed them to articulate power by covertly observing and controlling movement, as well as structuring socioeconomic and racial hierarchies on plantations. Creation of blind spots was accomplished by manipulating lines of sight across the region, by the strategic placement of structures, and by positioning structures at points that even facilitated auditory networks between estates. Ken Kelly's survey and excavation work on estates in the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe exemplifies a critically important comparison with data collected from estates on British islands. He contends that French Caribbean artifact distribution patterns, especially during the 18th century, contrast significantly with those observed in Anglophone contexts, like at the Seville estate on Jamaica. Kelly's work suggests that material differences between European imperial systems in the Caribbean contributed to the distinct Creole cultures that developed in these places later on. Our own work on Montserrat's high-elevation Center Hills plantation landscapes attends to the broader context of industrial production and slavery. Using a multi-method survey approach involving an iterative process between extensive tracked pedestrian survey and airborne LiDAR analysis and GIS, we've located and documented one estate, Ferry Walk, that we've not yet been able to locate in any of the records, and a second called Bugby Hole, which was totally missed in 2 earlier surveys by David Waters and later by Miles and Munby. And it's also now inaccessible in the volcanic exclusion zone, so the LiDAR is the only way we can study this particular landscape. In addition to these examples, there exists a growing number of landscape-based studies that don't begin with the plantation, but instead aim to recover information about the spaces and people in between estates. Without a doubt, Doug Armstrong's study in the late 90s of the East End community on St. John set the bar for systematic survey of these marginal communities in the Lesser Antilles. Armstrong's work combined tax records, historic maps, and survey in an effort to chart the cultural and economic changes in the Danish West Indies that coincided with a period of increased land ownership by free black island residents in the late 18th century, and that was decades before emancipation. With 30 people split between 3 crews, Armstrong's team conducted an intensive survey in the steep terrain, walking transects at 5-meter intervals parallel to the hill slope. Their survey identified 50 individual house sites with associated activity areas, as well as terrace systems, wells, stone walls, and other features, which they mapped using a differential GPS and later GIS. The results of the East End survey re-identified a community who lived in the remote outskirts of St. John for over 150 years, but who still remained connected with the global circulations of goods and people through their own local maritime activities. Our current work in progress on Potato Hill in Montserrat also documents the experiences of an unidentified marginal community on the outskirts of plantation life. Potato Hill is nestled between 3 plantation estates, 2 bays, and on a former military outpost, and it too was occupied for over 150 years. Here, a couple years ago, land clearance afforded us the rare opportunity to do a gridded survey with 100% collection of surface finds. The distribution maps that we made of the finds aided in locating 4 structures on the hilltop a couple of which we're now excavating. These examples and other surveys, and here are just a few, have produced excellent multiscalar and diachronic results. But there also remains a conversation to be had about the involvement of survey in the prolific rescue-based and CRM work in some parts of the region. Some of the most exciting finds actually come from this type of work, most notably at the Argyle site in St. Vincent. This was a small Kalinago coastal village occupied in the late 16th to early 17th century, just prior to European settlement there. At Argyle, Leiden University's Caribbean Research Group uncovered European materials that were commingled with indigenous objects, both from the Lesser Antilles and the Greater Antilles, suggesting the types of mixtures of cultural influences that were already present here at the time of European settlement. Really cool stuff. I'm super jealous about their finds. Assisted by advances in technologies over the past few decades, survey in the Caribbean continues to develop as a multi-method hybrid technique that is, as Ken Kelly says, ready to challenge the assumptions of scale implicit in the colonial partitioning of the region. There are still big challenges ahead, most especially dealing with the regional comparability of survey data sets. So we're decades behind the conversations that Mediterranean archaeologists had years ago, especially the ones that contributed to John and Sue's side-by-side survey volume. Nevertheless, diachronic survey in the historical archaeology of the Lesser Antilles remains a small but growing practice, and current work is certainly demonstrating how plantation boundaries did not necessarily define community boundaries, and how and why activities took place at these out-of-bounds, liminal, less visible places. As John and I have said before, there is not, nor should there be, a one-size-fits-all approach to survey in the Lesser Antilles. There's ample room in the area to involve approaches that are well-suited to consider particular island contexts, entire islands, microregions, households, and in historical archaeology, sometimes even individuals as units of comparison. And there's ample room to produce data that will integrate local experiences within a global picture in ways that facilitate conversations about mobility, creolization, and local distinctions. Survey in the Lesser Antilles has proven its potential to take island archaeologists beyond the physical boundaries of the site, beyond the temporal boundaries of a particular period of interest, and hopefully, eventually, beyond the camps entrenched on either side of the Columbian Divide. Now, as a card-carrying island prehistorian, John's definitely brought a new breed of island archaeologists to the Caribbean scene. And although some of our work has led to excavations, John would much, much rather be surveying, and as evidenced by this picture, which is, although after last night, apparently he takes copious naps on survey projects too, so I thought this was just because I wasn't there and he was leading the excavation and said, let's just set up a tarp and nap instead, right? You know, they all got their rest. But he's had plenty of chances to do survey on Montserrat, and great survey. In fact, he felt quite at home a couple years ago when we encountered our first and really only plow zone to survey at the Upper Blake site. There were some important firsts for John on that survey. One was the Archaic period lithic assemblage that we found there, and he's modeling one of the lithics here. And the other was that he was confronted by a very angry group of carrot farmers who accused him and our team of stepping carelessly on seedlings, ruining their entire carrot crop for the year. Now, of course, any of us in this room who have conducted survey with John in a plow zone know that he would never let this happen under his watch, and he was quick to point that out when he was dragged by the director of the Montserrat National Trust the day before we had to leave the field into a roundtable meeting with the mediator between the officials of the National Trust, himself, and the angry carrot farmers, who produced a bill charging him for the outrageous sum of money for the entire crop. But, you know, John took a deep breath rather than panic and dump all of our rum drinking money into their lap and escape the island. John successfully called upon his 40-plus years of experience trekking across plow zones and quantifying distributions, And he came home and said, I'll get back to you guys tomorrow. And with a little bit of comparative research, he was able to actually settle the dispute by somehow calculating the estimated output of carrots at that elevation in those survey fields at current West Indian market prices. I don't know how he did that, but it shut them up. We could ask him about further particulars later. And for sure, this was one of many of John's ongoing and lasting contributions to Caribbean archaeology. Thanks.
Thank you, Krista. So we have some time for questions. These can be questions, well, for individual papers, but also points of discussion that people would like to bring up for the group as a whole, or just general comments if you haven't had a chance to talk yet and feel like speaking up. So Tom and I will moderate, but we'll open the floor.
I actually have, unless anyone has a pressing desire, I want to try and start a fight between Cyprian Brubank and Tom Garrison. Tom, where are you? Hiding in the corner. There seems to be, so you mentioned obviously in your work how my archaeology has taken peer polity and utilized it, right? There does seem to be a slight sense, thinking in terms of comparison, how we're interested in that, how Mediterraneanists, despite an enormously rich, dense body of data, turn outside of the Mediterranean sometimes to seek models to re-employ inside the Mediterranean. And it's not enormously clear to me that the obverse is true, right? Maionists, Andeanists, Pacificists, pacifists aren't necessarily reading JMA as it drops off the presses. Perhaps would you mind, maybe you might mind, saying why you think that might be? Again, under the banner of JFC comparison and things like that.
Well, I mean, we're myopic Maionists. We don't like to think about anything except for Maya. We're forcing you to do it. I think, what you're saying is generally true, but I would say it's a state of the discipline, maybe not specific to where I work. I think that the burgeoning field and the amount of specificity to be an expert in a region has caused us to not look as comparatively as maybe we used to. I actually think that when I was younger as an undergrad and not so focused on what I do, I used to read things more broadly than I do now. But I think that we do generally, when we're trying to invigorate our field and look for new ideas, we do look outside the areas that we work. I mean, it's sort of a natural thing to do. Of course, we don't always go back to the 80s for it, or the 70s with David Clark, but I think it's a positive thing, and it's great in this conference that you guys have included this section on New World archaeology and the influence of a figure like John that shows that those sorts of comparisons are still out there and still worthy of being made. So, you're right. I'm not a subscriber to the Journal of Mediterranean Archaeology. I read more of the teachings of John than I have ever. But
We can fix that.
But no, I guess my answer is I agree that we don't do it enough, and we should do it more. And it's get-togethers like this that I think force us to look at what we're doing in different places in the world and have productive discussions. Maybe not in this setting, but certainly later in the evening.
To attempt to kindle a fight has failed. I'm not going to start a fight with such a nice chap whom I've only just met. I think one thing that might be worth thinking about is Jack yesterday, following up on a conversation we had with Sue, was talking about serendipity. And I think one of the serendipities that's deeply shaped the way that Aegean and some of the wider comparative Mediterranean archaeologists have come out of it has been, and this is something I'd like to hear John talk about as well, what he saw in Colin Renfrew in a sense, and where a young John Cherry and what Renfrew's role in this is, because I think a great serendipity for all of us is that, as I understand it, the young Colin Renfrew, aged about 17 or 18, goes backpacking into, whatever one did then, into the Aegean, sees Cycladic figurines, develops a kind of aesthetic attraction to these things. That draws him into the Aegean. He does a PhD under Glyn Daniel, finished in 1965, which is not, by his own admission, a very theoretical PhD, but has anchored in that regional sequence. He then goes out and has his Keatsian moment sometime in the late 60s, and comes back within 3 or 4 years. You have the emergence. And I mean, from what I understand, if it hadn't been for Colin and the emergence, you wouldn't have had him as a kind of attractor of minds like John's into the Aegean specifically, and specifically not into Aegean prehistory. And I suspect without that kind of path, path sort of fashioning, a lot of Aegean archaeology today would look a lot more like a lot more of the archaeology in the Levant, which is still struggling with a biblical heritage and to kind of free itself up from these positions. So I suspect that's one reason. It's a kind of example of people like Colin and then John following that encouraged us to think comparatively and creatively. That's one point. The other point, coming back to Bill's paper, I think, is that there is this trade-off between scale and detail. I think Andrew Sherratt always lamented the fact that, I've forgotten who it was that said that V. Gordon Childe was the last person who could actually know everything you needed to know about European prehistory to write at that scale and write successfully. And everyone else, all of us subsequently, we're going to have to cut corners with the data. And it's something I've wrestled with in my recent work. I don't know everything about the Mediterranean. I don't know if that machine's still on, but I don't know everything about the Mediterranean. But what we trade off is what advantages we get for our field by actually cutting corners in that sense and going larger and then ultimately going comparative.
You want me to say something about serendipity? Because I've increasingly come to think that
It's also
serendipity is absolutely central to archaeological practice. For many years I still to a large extent push back against the notion that to be a good archaeologist you have to be lucky in what you find. I perhaps accept Professor Davis and Griffin Warren in that regard. In fact, the book of Lewis Binford's essays that I helped put together in the early 80s, actually the first essay, is I think a fictive conversation with a gentleman on a bus when Binford was in England and Northern Europe giving these lectures, and he alleges that the man on the bus said, "Oh, it must be wonderful being an archaeologist because all you have to do is be lucky." Right? I think our discipline, now has much better tools to not rely on luck for what we find. But I agree entirely with what I think Cyprian is trying to put across, that serendipity is really important in terms of how our individual careers and the careers of groups of people working together actually play out. If certain things had not happened, then a whole bunch of other things would not have happened, right? If the Joukowskis had not given a bunch of money to found this institute, I would not be here in Brown, and if I had not come to Brown, I would not have met Krista as an advanced graduate student in anthropology, and that would have meant that the SLAM project would not have taken place, so I would not currently be working in the Caribbean. I mean, that's just one little idea, a little example of the extent to which I think serendipity really does govern what all of us do to an extent that I think we don't often acknowledge. So I was glad that Jack, framed his remarks yesterday around that notion.
Jared, do you have something?
Yeah, I just add to that. It's very hard to imagine, I think, even for me to remember what classical archaeology was like in the early 1970s and the Aegean prehistory. It was a point in time when you could, with some effort, as a graduate student, read everything in Aegean prehistory. There was really so little published. On the island of Crete, it was still the Palace of Nestor, which or the Palace of Minos was still your basic resource for understanding Minoan archaeology. There hadn't been an American excavation on the island of Crete since Harriet Boyd Hawes and Richard Seeger. I think things have changed so enormously. But going to graduate school, I was aware that things were going on in anthropology because I did a little anthropology as an undergraduate. And I knew the name Binford. But when I got to graduate school, we were forbidden to take courses in anthropology. And the explanation was that anthropologists in general were misguided, and those at the University of Cincinnati weren't even very good anthropologists. So what we started to do was there were undergraduates in the department who were exempted from these rules that the graduate students were held to, and they took courses in anthropology, and they would come back and hide in plain brown envelopes readings that they got from their anthropology classes, and these would circulate among the graduate students. And I think we were very much conditioned to be rebels at that point in time, not to be led by our professors, but in fact to do exactly the opposite of what they told us to do. And for me, one of the defining moments in all of this was when an unlikely person who herself ended up in Cincinnati through a concatenation of events, falling in love with an excavation architect in Sicily, ending up in Lexington, Kentucky with a little baby. Husband leaves her. So what does she do? Come back to graduate school. This is Gloria Pinney, who retired from Harvard. Gloria walked into the department one day, again, with a book that she'd just gotten from this place called Blackwell's. It was the first time I ever heard of Blackwell's. And she set it on my desk and she said, "Jack, this is the most important book ever written in your field. You need to read it." It was Renfrew's Emergence of Civilization that she'd just ordered up. So had all that would not happen, I wouldn't have been so excited about meeting Robin Torrance and John Cherry, and the thrill of working with Renfrew was amazing. In part because Renfrew wasn't Jack Caskey. And it was something naughty that I was doing and rebelling. So it all has to, there's so many accidental factors that play into the development of the academic career, as we would say.
At one point, we're sort of lurching towards a story about someone trying to take a photograph in Corinth in the mid-70s and falling, breaking their foot. The trousers of time would separate.
That happened too. But John went to, as I remember, the reason John went to Texas, somebody brought it up last night. I don't know why I'm telling this rather than him. But he went to Texas, am I not right? Because it was the most exciting archaeology that you could find being done at the time, which was Jim Wiseman, doing exciting interdisciplinary archaeology in Stobie and other places. It was a happening place. And then it moved to Boston, and Boston was a happening place. But John moved from classics to anthropology.
Other thoughts or questions for speakers or otherwise?
I mean, one thing about serendipity, when I was working on that paper, I dug a little bit into the sociology and the work of Merton and so on, and they said, and often in academic cases of serendipity, we erase our tracks. We find, we are looking for serendipity. You're looking for one thing, and you find another, and that often it's like, well, I was looking for this, I found this, so I'll just pretend that was where I was going in the first place, and how flattening that is of the nature of our research, and how often that shuts down. Well, why didn't that work? And someone else can take it in a different direction. In terms of the serendipity of academic or intellectual genealogies, I and maybe this is just because I'm getting old, but I sometimes think it's important that we tell these stories. And I'm sure for some of the young ones, you're sitting here thinking, man, who are these in jokes, and the time he got drunk and all that, and how I met who, and but I think start even now to start figuring out the chains and the networks, and just remember, you're going to go to a conference. Introduce yourself to someone new, or make an effort to just go in another direction, because that's what you're hearing here. So I guess let's not cover. Well, I don't think anyone's been covering up any mistakes they've made in their life so far at this conference. So
It's right up there.
Transparency.
Mick.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on something that Cyprian mentioned earlier, which was not about serendipity, but about counterfactuals. And the idea of, what if there were no islands in the Caribbean, right? Does that change the narrative? And it got me thinking about an article probably some of us have read. Chris Morehart has this article in 2012, I think, in American Anthropologist. What if the Aztec Empire never existed? What would have happened? What would have been the trajectory of other highland polities in Mexico? And I like this approach, and I like this idea, and I think this maybe is something that works particularly well for islands, because you can sort of rub them off without having to maybe do too much to the surrounding area. Unlike, you can't quite rub out highland Mexico maybe as easily. So, yeah, just a thought on maybe a different type of serendipity, and something worth still considering.
Crete didn't exist.
Well, one of the best examples is the Aegean, because of course Santorini does actually blow up halfway through the Bronze Age.
Yeah.
And there has been good study done by Carl Nappert and others on how the island network of the southern Aegean changes when you take out Santorini. Which of course it does, because it's bag in the middle and it's a kind of great attractor. So you can, that's not counterfactual, that happened, but you can still play with it. And I think one of the...
Liz Schofield wrote it.
Liz Bitten Without...
Before and after.
1982 or something, yeah, exactly. And I think what's quite fun is there's quite a narrow gap between counterfactual and the kind of simulation modeling that you can do, which is, in a sense, rather than oppose a fiction and a truth, you can actually play with a kind of whole range of possibilities and see, in a sense, what the limits of affordance and where the kind of cusp points are that do change, how resilient some of these patterns are, and where they're sensitive to radical change with quite small, tweaks of the conditions.
Stuart?
I just have to follow up with that. Which is good.
I've mentioned Santorini.
Courtesy of Bernard. Actually, the counterfactual approach, which is after all almost an old-fashioned historical model, which has many useful historical applications, but this case, Nappert et al. Write a rigorous study. But there's this German conference and this paper that just came out in the Proceedings of the Prehistoric Society, which I read once, and I conclude I have to read a second time because it can't be as stupid as it seemed from the first reading. But the point being, the very same situation, they managed to come up with an almost diametrically opposed interpretation than the one that the Nappert et al. Study which brings up the problem with any form of counterfactual study. How do you apply any form of control over the answer? So in the sense of, what is the robustness test? So it's an intellectual exercise, that I think is valuable, but I do see an issue in the sense of, and where does it go? So I heard the can you rub out the highlands, where I'm sure the answer is, of course the answer is yes, but it's the utility beyond the questioning of some of the assumptions, it's the utility of where you go beyond that.
And the transparency of the assumptions and such things as well. Yeah.
Those who haven't read their current PPS, you'll spot the article. It's clearly worth at least looking at it once.
Roberto Reich, who happens to be the archaeology editor for DPS. Otherwise, I can't imagine any respectable archaeological journal published. And it's followed up by another article by Christensen and Company, which is a continuation of Christensen and Larson and these super networks of the European Bronze Age, all driven by metallurgists and their kingly connections.
So this is turning into a sort of session on which is your least favourite article of 2015.
Might be a really fascinating series.
Hands up.
There's a chicanery of editors as well.
Yeah, we can always foster conversation.
Perhaps we should add some coffee to the mix to continue our discussion of these favorite articles. So we're back again at 4:10.